tonight's double bill, I think, is hard to beat. The Narrow Margin and Rafifi. And is there any other place you would rather be other than here tonight? Our first movie, The Narrow Margin, I can truthfully say this is the one that changed me, that changed my life. I ended up writing a book about Charles McGraw. I ended up becoming friends with some of the people who made the movie, who were in the movie. And 25 years ago, in 1999, The Narrow Margin was the first movie shown at what was then called the First Annual Festival of Film Noir. And the guests that night were Marie Windsor, the producer Stanley Rubin, bless them both, and the director Richard Fleischer, who was here. And Richard Fleischer was a great friend of the American Cinematheque, and I think he's one reason why the American Cinematheque here 25 years later is really thriving. So bless him as well. So tonight we have Richard's son, Mark Fleischer, here to introduce The Narrow Margin with me, and Mark is a great friend, a great person, and a great producer in his own right who spent a lot of time with his dad on set and working. So please welcome our special guest, Mr. Mark Fleischer. Thank you. So Mark, here we are again, and I should say that Mark and I have done this several times, and he and his lovely wife, Susan, who is here tonight, have been out to my festival in Palm Springs for another one of his dad's great movies, Violent Saturday. Here we are with The Narrow Margin again. And Mark, this picture really changed your dad's career arc. And could you elaborate a little bit on that, on how this film made such a difference to your dad's career?
Well, it was really actually seminal for his career.
Right.
Because he came to Los Angeles to direct B movies for RKO at the time when Howard Hughes was the owner, and Sid Rogel was the head of the B unit movie. And my father came in and he directed a number of movies, and then he finally got assigned to The Narrow Margin. And for him, it was a real opportunity to show his abilities and his creativity and his talent. And he said to me that once he saw his own movie, he said, "I think I created something kind of special."
And he did. He certainly did. And what's interesting is we showed Armored Car Robbery on Monday, which was the second film that was shown here. It was a double bill of The Narrow Margin and the Armored Car Robbery. And I remember your dad out in the lobby. He was comfortable with The Narrow Margin, but he's saying, Armored Car Robbery, will it hold up? You know, will people really like it? And of course they did. But there was kind of an interrelation between those two movies, were there not?
Yes, there was. One of my father's favorite writers was Earl Felton. And Earl was a legend and lived kind of on the shadowy side of life. He was a really wonderful, interesting character. He was one of the closest friends of our family forever. Mm-hmm. And Earl wrote Armored Car Robbery. Now, the original title of that movie was Target. And the reason for that is because the first third of the show, and I think most of you have seen it, was a suspense-building number of sequences where the hero of the show was putting together a fantastic team of crooks who were going to pull off some sort of caper, and you didn't know what it was. And so the whole first third of the show was building that suspense, and finally it was revealed that they would rob an armored car, which no one had ever done before. And the movie was called Target. And just before they came out with the movie, the studio sent a memo to my father and to Earl and said, "We've decided to change the name of the movie to Armored Car Robbery." which completely destroyed
any suspense.
whole suspense.
Yeah.
Now, Earl was a practical joker. Sometimes he went over the line a little bit, but in this one I don't think he did quite. So when they were developing The Narrow Margin, and I don't mean to be a spoiler here because I think most of you have probably seen the movie, Earl wrote a fake memo to my father and put it on his desk. And it was from the studio, who said, "We've decided to change the name of Narrow Margin to Dead on Train." Well, my father became apoplectic. But Earl said, "It's okay, we'll call it DOT," because DOA had just come out. Right. So they're going to call it DOT.
DOT, Department of Transportation. Oh, God. Now, Earl played a part in your life later on when you lived in Rome, and if you can tell an abbreviated version of that story, and I believe your dad was there making the film Barabbas, which is actually a terrific film, the best of its type in my mind. But
thank you for that.
What happened when Earl showed up in Rome?
Catastrophe as usual. We were living in Rome, and one night the doorbell rang, and Earl Felton showed up. Now, Earl was one of our closest friends in Los Angeles. We were not expecting him. And he said, "Can I come and stay with you a few weeks?" And we said, "Well, yes, of course, but why?" And he said, "Well, I just left London. The Prime Minister there, Profumo, has gotten into some trouble. And for some reason, the British Secret Service believes that I'm involved with it." He said, "So they visited me last night, and they interviewed me, and they said, 'Of course, you'll be here tomorrow when we want to have you come in and to talk to you.'" So, of course, he got on a plane that night and flew to Rome. So we had Earl living with us for about 3 or 4 months, hiding out from the British Secret Service. And he became my mentor. I was about 13 years old and a young lad in high school.
Impressionable, of course.
Yes, I still am, by the way. And one night my parents left to go to London. In fact, I think it was the night for the premiere of Barabbas. And they left me with the babysitter, Earl Felton. The only time I really questioned my family's judgment. And Earl decided to take me out clubbing. I was 13 years old. Well, let it be said that in the morning I had a French final, and so I came into school the next morning, and I wrote my French final, and it came back, and I looked at it, and the writing went like that, and then like that, and they very charitably gave me a D-. So my mother always wanted to write the short story called The Babysitter.
Now, your dad, the narrow margin, played a part in your father leaving the studio, because when I was doing research 20 years ago, I came across a memo that Howard Hughes wrote to the head of the editing department at RKO, saying, "Can you re-edit?" And this was, he wanted the film re-edited so that Robert Mitchum and Jane Russell would play the parts that Charles McGraw and Marie Windsor played. And then he added all this stuff, and it was 13 pages of this. And, you know, just reading it objectively, you come to the conclusion, this guy's nuts. Totally. But The Narrow Margin and a succeeding film that I think a lot of our audience is familiar with, His Kind of Woman, really played a part in your father ascending out of RKO and out of the B unit. How did that work?
Not very well. I'll back up just a little bit because you said he was nuts. He was very eccentric, Mr. Hughes. And my father and Earl had a story conference with him one day at the Beverly Hills Hotel. Now, Earl was stricken with polio as a young child, and he always walked with a cane and a crutch. And he also had to have regular meals because of what this disease had done to his system. So they started a story conference, and it went on and on and on. And it got to be lunchtime, and Earl was just dying. He just needed to have some food. Right. So he stopped Howard, and he said, "I'm so sorry, but I absolutely need to have some food to continue this conference." And Hughes was mortified. And he said, "I'm so sorry. I'm absolutely," and he ran over to the phone to call room service. And Earl was thinking, great, a steak and a scotch and an ice cream. And Mr. Hughes picked up the phone and he ordered for Earl a glass of milk. But to go further on, the movie was a very good movie for my father, but Howard Hughes would never release a film that he hadn't actually screened. So once my father had made the movie, he decided that he would never direct another B movie again. He thought he had really proven himself, so he would just make bigger movies. Now, there was this director at RKO by the name of William Burke. He was known as King of the Bees. He actually directed 8 movies a year. He had a $100,000 budget on each movie and a 10 to 12 shooting day schedule. And this was a cautionary tale for my father, and that's why he decided that he would not direct another B movie, because Mr. Burke really begged the studio to give him a big movie. And after a few years, finally they did. And they gave him a big movie with $1 million schedule and with a whole big a schedule of several months to shoot it. And he delivered that movie in 10 days. My dad refused to do another B movie, and he was put on suspension. Now, he was put on suspension by his mentor, Sid Rogel.
Yeah, Sid Rogel, I remember talking with Stanley Rubin one night. I said, "How is Sid Rogel as a producer?" And he said, "He kind of reminded me of a bouncer in a nightclub."
That was rather charitable.
Yes, it was. But your stories about Sid.
So my father got mad at Sid, but Sid, of course, had to do it because the studio ordered it. So now my father's on suspension. Stanley Kramer comes to him and says, "I have this movie I want to make at Columbia called High Noon, and I'd like you to direct it." But he couldn't because he was on suspension. He couldn't do anything. So my father sort of rallied his family around him, and he instructed my brother and me. My sister wasn't born then. And he gave us a chant, and the chant was, "Sid Rogel, son of a bitch. Sid Rogel, son of a bitch." We were actually instructed to repeat this several times a day. And whenever we got in the car and we drove past RKO, we were instructed to lean out the window and spit at it. And it became known affectionately in our family as the Spit Building. So even though Sid Rogel had suspended my father went to him and said, "What do I do?" And Sid said, "Write Howard Hughes a letter." Mm-hmm. So my dad wrote him a letter and said, "Mr. Hughes, you're ruining my life." And Mr. Hughes listened. Howard Hughes was famous for changing the ends of his movies, like, quote, fixing them. Yeah. Narrow Margin had sat in his screening room for a year before.
It was actually, I think it was finished in May of 1950, and it was released in in 52. It was almost 2 years from the movie was finished, and then there was a lot of playing around with it. But yeah,
but that's exactly right.
He would hold on to it.
And as Alan just said, that Hughes, once he saw it, loved it so much, he said, "Let's remake it as an A-level movie," and put in Bob Mitchum as Charlie. And Jane Mansfield is
Jane Russell.
Jane Russell is
right.
Marie Windsor. Now, my father was terrified because he knew that he wouldn't be asked to direct it. So he wrote this letter to Howard Hughes, and Howard said, I'll make a deal with you. I've just finished a movie called His Kind of Woman with Bob Mitchum, and there's a fight at the end of the movie that doesn't work. If you would redirect that, reshoot that fight, it'll take you 10 days to 2 weeks. I will end your suspension retroactively. I will allow you to make the movie that Stanley Kramer now is asking you to make, which was
Happy Time.
The Happy Time, and I will release The Narrow Margin unchanged. Pretty good deal. So my dad said yes. The 10 days to 2 weeks turned into months and months.
A year.
A year, actually. And he did that, and Howard Hughes stuck to his deal and released the movie, and it really was the foundation for my father's passing into the A-level area of movies.
Yeah. Now, we should mention that in addition to your father, your grandfather was the great Max Fleischer, the great animator. I know when you grew up in your family, there was one word that was forbidden to be mentioned in the Fleischer household, and that word was Disney. So elaborate a little bit on that.
Well, my grandfather was the sweetest, nicest, and most gentle man that you could ever imagine. But if you said Disney, he would become apoplectic. It was really just terrible. So my dad came to Hollywood and made his movies and Narrow Margin, etc. And one day he was sitting in his office and he got a call from his agent who said, I just got a call that was very bewildering. Walt Disney wants to see you in his office tomorrow. My father said, really? But he went. So there was, when he arrived at Disney's office, there were all kinds of storyboards of Nautiluses and submarines and stuff. And Disney said to my father, I'm going to make my first totally live-action movie. Have you ever read the book 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea? And my father said, yes, of course I did. And he said, well, that's the movie we want to make. It'll be the most expensive movie ever made. If it fails, it will bankrupt the studio. And would you like to direct it? My father said, well, of course I would like to direct it, but do you know who I am? And
who my father is.
Yeah, well, he said, yes, you're Max's son. And my father said, well, look, yeah, I want to direct your movie, but I need to call my father to ask his permission because I don't want to appear to be a traitor to the family. Now, we didn't actually have a firing squad in those days. We do now, but so Disney said that's exactly the right thing to do. Go home, put a call through to New York. You had to do that in those days, and ask your dad. So my father called his father, and Max, of course, said, are you out of your mind? Of course, direct this movie. It's your big chance into A-level movies. And I want you to tell Walt Disney one thing. Tell him he has great taste in directors. So my dad directed the movie. It was a big hit, as you all know. And Walt became a friend of the family's. I grew up knowing him as Uncle Walt. And one day my father was on the phone with Walt, and by that time my grandfather's studio had gone out of business, and most of his animators were working for Walt Disney. And Walt said to my father, I'd like to extend an invitation to your father, my father had told him he was coming into Los Angeles, to host a reunion with all of his animators that are now working for me. And my grandfather accepted, and they had the reunion, and the two men reconciled and became friends for the rest of their lives.
That is a great happy ending.
And they were bitter enemies, bitter competitors.
Yeah. Your father directed so many great movies, Compulsion, The Vikings, The Boston Strangler, 10 Rillington Place, Bandito, so many others. But he was very gentle and soft-spoken, but I think they called him the Iron Butterfly.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
that was a term.
You worked on the set with him. What was that experience like?
Well, it was really terrifying for it's the only person, the only boss I ever had that threatened to take away my allowance. This moniker was given to him by the English crews, where he worked a lot with. He was a very, very gentle man, but there was steel behind his gentleness. And I'll never forget when he took over the movie Tough Enough. And I came on that movie as an associate producer. And he sat down with the crew, and he said, nobody talks to the actors. Only tell them how great they are. And no one goes to dailies. It's just me and the producer and the director of photography. Mm-hmm. And of course, the makeup person and the costume person said, well, how will I know what my work is looking like or if there's anything that's wrong? And my father said, if there's a problem, I'll tell you, and I'll invite you to look at it. But he said, this is not a time for a social event. And he was very, very controlling in a nice way.
Business-like.
Business way, and he would say to the sound person, if you have a problem with the gain or the volume with the actor, you may not talk to the actor. Tell me, because I may be getting the best performance I've ever gotten from that actor. So I'll tell the actor what to do, and we'll fix the technical problem.
I remember calling your father 25 years ago, and he wasn't feeling too well. And so I said, well, sorry to bother you. And he goes, no, just keep calling me back. And he said, you're going to get me on a good day, and then you won't get me off the phone. And I did that, and he was right. We were on the phone for 2.5 hours, and he told me all about the making of this picture and how much he and Stanley Rubin actually got someone to storyboard a lot of the shots, which was unusual. The picture does not have music, which was unusual in 1950 for that. And I asked him, of course, about McGraw, who I was interested in, and I remember he said, Charlie was a damn good actor, but he had one issue. And I said, what was that? And he said, beer. But Mark, it has been such a pleasure having you here. And your dad, when I made that remark at the top of the show about him being so important to the Cinematheque, he really was. And I'll never forget the last time he was here, we screened Bandito, and at the end of it, Robert Mitchum is on a train, and he's doing this, and he's waving, and the shot's pulling away, and your dad stood up, and he waved at the screen like he was saying goodbye. And your dad was one of the best, and so are you, and this movie has stood the test of time. Look at the audience. The place is practically full to see this. So,
to you.
With that, thank you so much. Thank you, Mark, and let's enjoy the narrow margin. Thank you.
Thank you.